welcome. It is time for a brand new edition of Member Talks, and this is going to be a great conversation. We actually have two guests joining us today. Tim McLoone, who is a licensed funeral director and certified celebrant, and we'll get into a little bit more of his background in just a few moments. We also have Dr. Sara Murphy, who, if you've listened to our suicide talk a few months ago, she joined us a few months ago and talked to us, and we'll tell you a little bit more about her. But before we get into your bios, Sara, Tim, how are you?
Great, Rob. Thanks so much for having us.
Yep,
absolutely.
I'm wonderful. And yeah, we really appreciate you having us on and having this conversation with us. So we're excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you on here. I know we tried a little while and schedules just didn't work out. It's hard enough to schedule with one other person, but when you try to schedule with two people or more, it really gets confusing. So I'm glad it worked out. We're excited to get you on here. And we want to talk about something that's very important, something that we see in the news a lot, but more importantly than that, just basic human, what's the word? I guess how we treat each other. And I guess that's the best way to put it. So let me go into, before we get into this conversation, let me kind of introduce the both of you and give some of the background. So it leads into what our topic of discussion is going to be. So as I said, Tim McLoone is a licensed funeral director and certified celebrant for Joseph A. Fleur III Funeral Home located in Pennsylvania. Licensed in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey, Tim has cultivated high levels of knowledge and expertise through his extensive work in all facets of the business while working in both corporate and family-owned business settings. He earned his BA in communications from York College of Pennsylvania and his AAS in funeral service education from Northampton Community located in Bethlehem, where he serves as a member of the department's advisory board. As an out member of the LGBTQ plus community with over 13 years of funeral service, Tim has observed firsthand the need for better understanding of the queer community in the profession. Armed with the passion for growth and change, Tim is dedicated to ensuring that queer identified funeral professionals and those whom we serve in the queer community are accepted and supported. In June of 2021, Tim was featured in the American Funeral Director magazine's profile titled Committed to Making a Difference. So welcome, Tim McLoone. I want to also welcome back Dr. Sara Murphy. Sara is a death educator, certified thanatologist with the Association for Death Education and Counseling. She's a suicidologist with 15 years of scholarly, I don't even know what that one is. How'd you say that one?
Pedagogical?
Pedagogical. You're going to have to tell me what that is in a few minutes. Professional experience in the field. Sara is the faculty member at the University of Rhode Island, where she has developed and taught many interdisciplinary courses on death, dying, and bereavement, disenfranchised populations, and the means of death. Publicly, she conducts professional development and educational workshops and seminars on specialized topics for death, dying, and the bereavement nationwide for businesses, schools, and community groups. Dr. Murphy is a suicide and bereavement consultant and legal consultant, as well as the author of the booklet, Grieving Alone and Together, Responding to Your Loss of Your Loved One During the COVID-19 Pandemic, which is a free resource for helping funeral professionals and individuals, published by the Funeral Service Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Murphy. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you
for joining us. Now, before we get into it, say that again. I can't even say it.
Pedagogical. It's fine. It's just a fancy way of saying teaching in higher education. Your specific kind of ethos or approach to teaching.
Okay.
I left all those big words out of mine.
Yeah, we like them small. Small words. This is, we just celebrated Independence Day. We just celebrated July 4th. We're recording this on the 7th of July. We just ended Pride Month, June. I wanted to have you come on and talk with us about what that means. What is Pride Month? Tell us about the LGBTQ community and how we as funeral professionals can better work within the community, better support the community. What I know, we in many places are well behind the eight ball, so to speak, of how we communicate. And I'm going to just throw this out there. I am guilty of that. I am well behind the eight ball. And so if I say something goofy, if I say something offensive, I don't mean it. But I do want you to correct me so that I know what the proper terms are. But tell me first off, it just seems to me like it's one of those things. I know I've heard the story, but I'd like for you to kind of express it again. How did this whole idea, this whole concept of going out into the public, going to the conventions, that sort of thing, how did that all come about? What was the driving force, or where did it start for you? Because you guys do this together. You guys go out together, even though you're in separate parts of the, well, kind of the same part of the country, but separate. But you do this together. How did this happen?
I think it was probably a really long road for each of us, and we both have such passion and extensive backgrounds in advocacy to begin with. But in terms of how we got where we are as partners in these workshops and presentations, it was really by happenstance. And I really actually just like how Tim tells the story about how we met so much better than I do it. So I'm going to kick it over to him for the magical serendipity of how we met.
My dramatic reading of the story of how we met. No, so it really is. It was happenstance, kind of like serendipitous a little bit. Sarah and I were both in attendance at the 2019 Chicago NFDA convention. Sarah was presenting, and I was attending actually as a scholarship recipient through the Funeral Service Foundation. So I was there just to take it all in, become a certified celebrant, get a chance to see the big NFDA convention. So about the end of the day, I was boarding an elevator to head upstairs to the lobby of the hotel where it ended up we both were staying. And out of the corner of my eye, I see somebody who's like trying to make the same elevator. And I quick, put my arm out and held the door. And on Sarah comes to the elevator and she sees my little ID tag and she goes, "Well, I guess if something went horribly wrong there, I would have been in the elevator with the right person." And it just broke the ice instantaneously. We laughed, and the elevator made it to the lobby. And what really kind of cemented, I think, one of our meeting was that we both then got off the elevator and beelined for the line for the free happy hour that the hotel puts on every evening. But it was with that we had the opportunity to sit and talk, get to know each other. We ended up breaking bread together and having dinner that night. And during the course of our conversation, I shared with Sarah how, in my years of experience in funeral service, I was kind of feeling a little alone as far as not really seeing a lot of visibility or conversation about the LGBTQ community, whether it's in publications or at conventions and workshops, things like that. I wasn't seeing the topic anywhere. And I shared with her how a mutual contact and friend of ours with NFDA had already kind of talked to her about this deficiency. And when she learned that Sarah and I had connected the night before, it was kind of like, well, let's get this going. Submit an application, a proposal to speak, and it ended up that we did get a spot at the 2020, what ended up being virtual, of course, convention. And our workshop had, I think it was a little over 160 people attend, which we were really blown away by. But I think what meant even more to us then was the feedback we got. And in real time, we saw people commenting about how happy they were that we were doing this, how it felt so liberating to them, to be seen. So it's been a journey, and we're just continuing on for the ride as long as we can.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just going to say, it's amazing how one simple act of kindness can change an entire trajectory of your career, of what you do. I mean, just holding the elevator door for a stranger. And now here you are teaching courses and talking to people all over the country, probably all over the world, actually, with the way this goes out. So that's really, that's an interesting story, but it's intriguing to me how, like I say, one simple little, I'll just catch the door, imagine how different it would have been if you would have said, forget it. You can catch the next one.
It's true. I like to think we probably would have met eventually from a mutual contact.
Sure.
But there was something so organic about, just meeting and talking about all of this passion we have for queer representation and for social justice and for equality. And I was coming into it with, a history of advocacy, but also this theoretical grounding in thanatology for disenfranchised populations. And Tim was coming from the funeral world where many queer people are still closeted, and where microaggressions and hostile work environments are not a thing of the past. And we sort of organically built out, we tailor all of our workshops, but we built out workshops, spoke to both of our strengths and backgrounds while kind of becoming instant friends, which has been another great benefit too. So yeah, it's been a wild how much traction and how much positive feedback we have gotten from different states and certainly from convention, but from different webinars we've done. Because yes, people want to be seen, as Tim said. And I think there's also a real awakening in people who are privileged because of their gender identity or their sexual identity, in knowing that it's just not okay to stay ignorant on these topics anymore. And they genuinely want to learn more, which is wonderfully gratifying.
One of the things that I heard you say, and it may have been at because I'd attended that virtual training at NFDA. It may have been on one of the other shows that I know you've been on, and I'm not sure where it was, but it was in referencing to, and it kind of caught my attention because it referenced the idea that there are so many people that are connected in one form or fashion, whether they're an out member of the community, whether they're friends of members of the community, whether they just know somebody. But there's so many people that are out there that the LGBTQ community, I guess you could say, represents or has people that can associate with. And I think that's one of the things when I look back over, my time and stuff. And as I said, I think that we get so tied up and we get those blinders on that when we think that, well, we're talking about the LGBTQ community, what we're talking about is really out members of the community, but not all the people that encompass the community. And I think that's important to point out, because we do hear that a lot of why should we change the focus of how we do our funerals? Why should we change the focus, our business structure, for one particular community and maybe not another community? But one particular community has so many outstretched arms, if you will, that people that are affected, I shouldn't say affected, but people that are associated with. And to me, it was intriguing. And I don't remember what the number was that you gave, but it just seemed like everybody out there has somebody or knows somebody or is connected to somebody that has a relationship within this community.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the numbers are really divergent as to the queer population in the US. The lowest estimate numbers are like 4 to 6%. Groups like the Human Rights Campaign think it's probably double that. But when you build out everyone who cares about someone in this community, you're reaching more and more people. Interestingly, when public opinion changed for marriage equality, And all the surveying was suddenly flipping into support for it before the Supreme Court decision. The pollsters who went out and asked people, what made you change your mind? The number one reason across the board was knowing and caring about someone who came out as gay or queer or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. And it's that human contact and that human relationship that I think we need to keep central, because I don't think this is about special treatment and changing how a business is run. I think it's just another piece of cultural competency, like learning how to, honor different religions and cultures and how they want funerals done. Being culturally competent in the queer space is often about very interpersonal things like communication and language and respect. In that sense, it's really just about serving equally.
And I think, Rob, you kind of mentioned about, why should it matter to businesses? And one of the things that Sara and I try to talk about, because it's important for people that are attending workshops and continuing education experiences that own businesses, of course, to have some takeaways. And the percentages that Sara mentioned, that 4 to 6%, and as you said, we talk about how, you build onto that, the allies, the advocates, the friends, family, the people that stand behind that 4 to 6%, not to mention that 4 to 6% is out individuals. Then you've got a whole other group that are not even out that you have to account for. But the way we bring it back to the business end of things is that why wouldn't you want to appeal to that market? That those percentages, though they may seem small, represent a market, and a market that by and large, from what I see, we're not necessarily embracing. And as Sara mentioned, it's just about being culturally competent. So, we need to know how to serve different religions and different races sometimes that walk through our doors and look for help. Why wouldn't we want to know a little bit about serving the queer community as well? And so we try to drive home that in little ways, a business can make it clear that they're friendly, can make it clear that they are educated, and that they're welcoming of the community. Because we also, in our community, tend to make sometimes buying decisions based off of businesses that we perceive as being LGBTQ plus friendly. And if we perceive that they're not, we will straight up not patronize that business. And again, so will the friends, the allies, the advocates, and all those people. Right. So it can be a detriment to a business as well if you're not just being well-rounded by including this community as part of what you do and who you serve.
Yeah. I want to get into that a little bit of how a business can show support. But before we do that, I guess I want to get a response from you, if I can, I totally hear what you're saying, and I believe in what you're saying. I think that we do need to support everybody. I mean, we're funeral providers. We need to support the community, period. Mm-hmm. No matter what community it is. And that's our job. We are there to be that profession, that person that cares for the dead, whether they're race, whatever their race is, whatever their orientation is, whatever that is. That's what we're there to do. How do we respond though to, and fortunately, I guess I don't hear it that often, so I guess I'm happy about that. I mean, that to me, that's one good thing, but I know that there are people that do absolutely say stuff like, we will not handle the case of somebody that's queer, or we will not, support that family. And it's like, how do you respond to that? What is a tactic? Not even a tactic, but what would be a good way to respond to that individual and say, why would you not support? I get what you're saying of, well, we won't go there anymore. And the rest of our community and people that support us won't, but there's got to be more than that. There's got to be something that says, if you're not going to do it, we're not only not going to support you, we're not only not going to patronize you, but we're not going to support you in any form or fashion. And how do we get more people involved with that?
Well,
is that making sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to recognize that bigotry still exists, and it exists in any profession, and it exists across many forms. And I think I would start by saying to someone, why won't you treat this family, and maybe try to help them through non-accusatory conversation, to get the education that they need, to get the education that might start to break down some of the prejudices or stereotypes that they might still be clinging to about queer people or queer families. And know that we can't always reach everyone as much as we try, but that's true for any social justice movement. You do keep trying. I would say, as someone who has advocated for this community my entire adult life, in many different ways, just like every other social justice movement toward equality, people in positions of privilege need to be willing to stand up and call people out. It can't just be like it was for decades. I mean, I'm thinking also as someone who works in the space of HIV/AIDS, it was the only time a pandemic hit a community that was then forced to take care of itself because no one else would take care of them.
Right.
Do that when it comes to LGBTQ rights. We need cisgender people and straight people and financially privileged people to stand up and say what you're doing is wrong and it's discrimination. And if you don't think it's discrimination, we can sit down and have a conversation about why it is. And I care about you, so I want to meet you where you are and help you get the education you need. But we know, and I certainly, I'm sure Tim will echo, that you can't change everyone's mind, but you're not going to stop trying.
And to add to that, I think that so much of it, what we see, is sometimes just based in fear or a lack of understanding. And so, to Sarah's point about just simple education is so important. And I hope too, and we hope by doing what we're doing now, that just the visibility can mean something. My hope is that people will see me for me, but also realize that I'm a member of the queer community. I'm in funeral service, and the funeral home I work for is not afraid to have a picture of my husband and I on our wedding day on the website. It hasn't hurt their business, that you can really embrace everybody and not be afraid to do that. And I think that's something else that we hope through all of this that we've been doing, that we can help with some of that and help ease some of that fear a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a real irony, I think, Rob. I mean, I've been only really working closely with funeral professionals for a few years now. But in all my work with thanatology and with different organizations and groups and deaf professionals, I've never come across a profession that has such a high proportion of queer members who are closeted in 2021. It's fascinating to me. And it was surprising to me when I started learning how prevalent that is for funeral directors who are LGBTQ to be in the closet at work, even if they're out in other spaces of their lives. And I think that speaks to both a professional need for within businesses for change, as well as a need for change for the clientele they serve.
Yeah. In fact, earlier, well, I shouldn't say earlier this month, it was actually last month in June, Pride Month. One of our people that we've had on the show, Parting Stone, put out I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but put out a downloadable booklet, how to make your funeral business LGBTQIA+ friendly. And that's something else I want to ask you about, is the acronym. It just gets bigger and bigger, and I know I guess I don't understand it, as I don't want to say understand it, I just don't understand why it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. but that's a different question. The very first thing on here caught my attention was, and this goes to what you just said, Sarah. According to this, morticians or undertakers or funeral directors are ranked as number 11 of the occupations with the highest joint proportion of gay and lesbian workers. Number 11, I mean, when you think of all the occupations that are out there, being number 11, why is there such a draw? If those numbers are accurate, why is there such a draw for the LGBTQ community into funeral service? Is it due to the wanting to help people, or is it, what is it? What's that draw?
That's a really complicated question. And I think we can speculate a response. I have seen similar, I've seen anywhere from 8 to 11, actually.
Wow, okay.
I think those numbers are pretty on point. Tim and I have talked about this a lot, and we talk about it a little in our workshops as well, in terms of the necessity for both cultivated empathy and also, I don't want to mangle the terms you used, Tim, being incredibly attuned to detail and in reading a room or in reading other people. You can speak to that better than I.
Well, yeah, no, it's the terminology in my research, and Rob, some of this may be in the book that you're mentioning. I did come across that too. It talks about social perceptiveness. That is the ability, as Sarah said, to just read situations, be aware in a way that is maybe a little higher level. And we as queer individuals kind of learn that skill at an early age, which is sort of an unfortunate reality, but we know we're different. In my case, knowing that the queer community was often marginalized and discriminated against taught me early on that I had to kind of feel things out, and I mentioned examples like just meeting new people and kind of feeling out a conversation, like, can I mention that I'm married to a man? Can I not? Is this a friendly group? Or things like just looking over like our shoulder to see if it's okay to hold hands on a street. These are things that are very real situations for us. And that leads to this high level of social perceptiveness, which I talk about the fact that when you are sitting at a table to make funeral arrangements with a family, that skill is invaluable. I mean, the ability to right off the bat know exactly kind of who's who, who's in charge, who's what you're dealing with. This one doesn't get along with this one. This is where the conflict's going to be. I mean, that skill is invaluable in funeral service, as I'm sure anyone can attest to. And it just turns out that we tend to possess a high level of that skill, which subsequently may be part of why we're led to this profession in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it's definitely interesting. And in fact, reading through this booklet as well, some of the stuff that they do talk about. You mentioned fear. Fear is a driving force. And just looking back and listening to you, I think it's, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's probably one of the biggest driving forces of why there's this lack of acceptance. And it's not necessarily fear of, I don't think it's fear of, oh my gosh, if I know this person, if I talk to this person that's part of this community, that's going to make me part of this community. I don't think that's the fear. I mean, I'm sure there's some of that from some folks, but I think the real fear is simply, for lack of better terms, ignorance of who it is that, and ignorance of how to accept somebody. And it shouldn't be that hard to me, I wouldn't think, to accept people for who they are. I mean, we're all different. We're all this big kaleidoscope of people of different colors and backgrounds and all these things. It shouldn't be that difficult. But it seems like it is. And I think that to me, that's where that fear might be coming from and I think part of that too is not just the fear of acceptance, but fear of how do I respond to or talk to. I mean, even I mentioned it before, in this booklet, it talks about the LGBTQIA plus community. For me personally, I understood up till we got to the Q, and then it was like, well, where'd these other letters come from? And I, be honest, I had to go look it up. because I did not know. And I think that's just ignorance on my part, but I also think that I don't know. Is what I'm saying making any sense to you? Have you heard these statements before? And am I way off track?
No, you're not way off track. I mean, there's a few things happening at once here that you should let yourself off the hook a little bit, Rob, because language itself is always changing. I did my PhD in English. I love words. I love language. The language within the community in and of itself is always changing. None of those letters represent a new term, but the way that we put them together is going to vary from organization to organization. Tim and I in our work use LGBTQ+, the plus speaking to the expansiveness of queer identities, that it's not just lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer persons, that queer itself, when used non-derogatorily and from allies and advocates and members of the community, speaks to as an umbrella term for all kinds of different identities. And the language is rapidly changing. I work with a lot of queer college students. I'm coming off a 3-month stint coordinating our Gender and Sexuality Center with a fully queer student staff. And they teach me language as it's sort of evolving for their generation too. So, knowing the language doesn't have to be harder than looking it up. Or asking someone, may I ask how you identify, or what pronouns do you use? And modeling that for people. So, when you're thinking about, at one point, our center was called the LGBTQIA Center. And when we moved, we got it down to Gender and Sexuality Center, so we wouldn't have to keep monkeying with the acronym. But we know that within what we call a community are a lot of individual sub-communities that historically were not all a community. Historically, there was a lot of division going back to, the gay rights movement of, I would say, starting in Stonewall, but really starting about a decade before that. That was really like a gay men's movement. And then in the 70s, it was really a sexual liberation movement. And it wasn't until, the 80s with the AIDS crisis, when so many members of the lesbian community came in as social workers and caregivers for gay and bisexual men who were dying, that they got sort of a seat at the table there. And I think back even to when I was working in Congress in the late 90s and early 2000s, and people didn't want to sit down with reps from the trans community. And we didn't have the kind of popular cultural representation that we do now either. All of which is to say, the language just gets more and more expansive. When we do workshops, we circulate, I think it's like a 12-page vocab list, like to get people started. And for the queer community, they're like basic terms. But, until you seek out the language, there's no reason necessarily that, cisgender and heterosexual people would have been exposed to it.
Yeah. Okay.
And Rob, I think you're right about what you say about the fear of even interacting with us wrong, saying the wrong thing, not knowing the acronyms. And I see that in myself. I'm part of the community. I have someone in my life who is transitioning right now from one sexual identity to another, gender identity, I should say, to another. And I don't even know, I'm a little fearful. Well, what if I use the wrong pronouns? And when do I use the new pronouns? And how do I even navigate knowing where they are in the process? And so I think that fear is real. And it's sometimes, when we don't understand something completely, it can be scary. But again, hopefully through a little bit of education, if people can understand things a little better, it alleviates some of that fear and just hopefully makes for an easier way to interact with a community that you're not as familiar with.
Sure. How can funeral homes, funeral providers, funeral professionals, whatever you prefer to call us, how can we as a group, either individually or as a location, as a district, as a state, as a nation, how can we be more open to, I guess, what can we do, I should say, to be more open to serving the LGBTQ community? It's got to be something. I can't imagine it's as easy as just putting it on your card that, or on your business card or something, but maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe it's just as simple as putting an emblem or something in the phone book. I don't know. What would you say is a way to do it? I mean, you work for a company, Tim, that, as you said, it totally accepts, the whole community. How is that working? Or not, how's it working, but how is it done?
Well, when we do these workshops, we talk about we address that exact question. And the way that I look at it is it doesn't have to be big, huge gestures, but it can be small things. And, I consider the picture of my husband, Michael, and I on our website to be a small thing, but if people see it, it may make a difference, and they'll feel much more comfortable knowing that they're going to the right place to make arrangements with a place that understands them and somebody who understands their community a little bit better. But we also talk about small symbols. You kind of mentioned it already, but a small rainbow flag icon on your website, or perhaps learning a bit more of the history of Pride Month, which you've mentioned already, that we're just coming off of Pride Month, which is our month, to continue to advocate for our community. And the rainbow flag has become very much a symbol for our community. And again, just like the acronym, the rainbow flag continues to grow and change a little bit each year, it seems, but that symbol is recognizable. And I always use an example that's personal, that when we were planning our wedding, we went online and looked at different venues just like anybody does. And the one that we ended up using for a litany of other reasons, but one of the reasons was that on their website, they had this little rainbow flag icon. I mean, it was the very bottom of the homepage next to, their social media links and all of that. And that really resonated with us. We knew, okay, like we can call them. We don't have to explain ourselves. We're not going to get questioned. They're not going to assume it's a bride and groom calling. We felt very comfortable. And I think little things like that can go a long way. And so those are some of the things we talk about. I know Sara can elaborate more too about just involving yourself too in the community more.
Yeah, absolutely. Tim and I give a lot of, tips and praxis in our workshops, but we always stress that we want to make sure that people are backing it up with real education, and not just sort of, trying to pander to the community, which would be very noticeable as soon as then you sat down with someone who had a pride flag but didn't know how to use pronouns. So, attaining education, whether it's through workshops and webinars like the ones that we do, and just attaining education from queer people, interacting with queer organizations. Something that I suggest for organizations that have some grounding and some education, but want to be more of an advocate and an ally, is to make sure that they're doing things like showing up at Pride festivals, getting a booth, maybe, bringing some swag, sponsoring things that, are going on during Pride Month, sitting down with reps from groups like the Human Rights Campaign. There's chapters in every state, or PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians, Gays, and Queer Persons, chapters in every major city, and saying like, hey, we need you to tell us what we should be doing better for your community. That goes a long way in terms of not just signaling that you want to meet the community where they are, but getting the kind of education needed there. So, I think doing all of this moves people in a better direction in terms of cultural competency and in understanding. And we talk about this a lot in our workshops, understanding the particular risks and circumstances for things like disenfranchised grief, or for survivors, being put in bad positions over things like arguing gender identity of a decedent, to be versed in all of that, to understand that there are particular concerns for the queer community in terms of grief outcomes too. is another piece, I think, of the education that is sort of hiding in plain sight for a lot of funeral directors.
So two questions came to mind. One that I wanted to address with you. My wife brought this to me the other day, actually, and I said, this is great because we got Tim and Sara coming on here, and I can just ask them. But the question was, and I think I know the answer to it, at least I know what I told her, and I'm hoping I was right. But the question was, in this state, in the state of Washington, every state's different. Every state has different rules, if you will, different laws. But there was a question that came up of a couple that was together. And I don't know the identities of the couple. It was somebody from her work, and I said, don't give me any of the details. But it boiled down to they weren't able to make the arrangements when one of them died, the other half to the couple, because they weren't legally married to each other. And I don't know what it is in all the states, but I know in this state, my answer to her was they should obviously plan for this ahead of time, number one, but get it in writing and create a, not necessarily a designated agent, but a designee of who can authorize certain things to be done. And I know you mentioned just a minute ago, Sara, about not being able to potentially be interred the way that you would want to be interred, or disposition the way you would want, because the way the legal system is, maybe somebody that doesn't share the same belief as you will not honor your wishes when it comes to how you want to be remembered. And I know this is kind of a long drawn out part of this, but I do think it's extremely important that you know the rules of the state that you're in. And if you want to make those arrangements and have that the way you want it, it seems to me like that's the best thing that you could do, is go out ahead of time and do that for yourself and for your significant other, your spouse, whoever the case might be. I mean, in line with the LGBTQ community, would that be a fair statement to make? To be able to say, go out and do this ahead of time so that you can have what you want done?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a very common refrain since I started collaborating with funeral directors. I say it constantly, but like, everyone should have a pre-need. And that would be one great space for that, in designating, who is going to be the contact person and the person who has a right of decision making. Have wishes in writing, absolutely. Tim, from a legal end, is there anything you'd add to that? Because I know we should talk about trans identities here too.
Well, yeah, and as far as rights of disposition, Rob, you're right. I mean, every state is different, although I think by and large, it typically follows marriage and then down a bloodline. And there are forms, I know in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, where I am licensed, that, can be executed ahead of time to really indicate who should be in charge of your arrangements if it is different than that bloodline or that next of kin, whatever the chain is that your state follows. And that's true for any couple too, or anybody. It doesn't need to be that you're a member of the queer community, but maybe you just don't have family and you know exactly what you want. You have a friend that you want to be in charge of your arrangements. I mean, it's simple. It just makes sense really for anyone. But as far as advocating too for change in that way, or advocating to make sure that people get ahead of that, we also talk about the issue of trans individuals, people who have changed their gender identities. And in many states, it is not possible to note that on a death certificate properly, or sometimes on a birth certificate. Washington State very recently added the ability to have X indicated as a gender on birth certificate, or in a request for the change of a birth certificate to reflect a gender transition had taken place. But there's a lot of states that don't allow anything like that. And so even if you have a situation where your family, will still embrace who you are, who you transition to be, in death, it doesn't mean that you won't be memorialized wrong on a death certificate. And so we as funeral professionals, I think, really have, the world is our oyster when it comes to trying to advocate for that. Because as Sara and I think will continue to go into more depth on in the future, the trans community is growing fairly rapidly. Sara, I think it's safe to say that. And so we as death care professionals, maybe not my generation, but the next generation is going to start seeing a lot more, people who have transitioned from their sex assigned at birth to something different. And we need to be ready to meet that community too, where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need to be ready to, as we've met virtually several times in webinars, embracing younger trans funeral directors, as, fully enfranchised members of the profession as well. And kudos to Washington State. This just changed. This was a real change that DOH put in January 1 to have for gender non-binary or fluid persons to not have to check either male or female and to have that reflected on their birth certificate. I would urge anyone in any of the states that are passing these measures who have transitioned or who are transitioning through whatever means they're choosing to do so, get that birth certificate change done, get that paperwork filed, because then you've got it right there, legally binding on paper, and you can't have that taken away from you under that state law. So that's a good step there for sure.
Well, that's kind of why I wanted to bring that up in this, because I wanted to get out there to people, and it goes exactly what you just said, Sara. Get it done, get it changed if you're going to, but it goes directly with the and don't get me wrong when I say get the pre-plan done. I'm not saying prepay for it. I'm saying get it down on paper, what you want, because once it's on paper, it's official. And once it's on paper, it's technically binding, at least in this state. Signed, dated witness becomes binding document. Too often we spend time not thinking about or trying to push that thought of death aside, because we're never going to die. We're never going to have to experience this, but all too often people are experiencing this every day all across the world. Of they, like I said at the beginning, the couple that have been together for 30 years but aren't legally married, so therefore one cannot make the decision for the other. And to me, that just seems extremely sad when you are put into that position, especially when you think, look, I've done everything I can for this person. There's nothing else that I could have done except for plan this funeral or whatever the case might be. And now you're saying I can't do that. So I wanted to put it out there and chat about that briefly. I do have one more question for you, and then we are getting a little lengthy, so I'm going to end it with this question. It's a two-parter though. So what can the owner, the manager, the non-member, let's say the non-member, for lack of better terms, the non-member of the LGBTQ community do for their employees, whether they are or are not affiliated, associated members of the LGBTQ community? What can the decision makers do to open that acceptance up? And then the second part to that question, what can the employees do for those decision makers, whether they are part of the community or not, whether they're in or out? What can they do to see that growth or that change made in the location where they're working? That's a long one.
Yeah. You're known for the long questions though, Rod.
Yeah. Sometimes they're real quick, but other times it just kind of goes on and on. I'm
taking my mental notes as we go here. Well, I think I'd start, and I know Tim has a lot to say on this as well, because he talks a lot about this in our workshops, but I'd foreground all of it in speaking directly to any business owner or manager or person in a position of authority, with a reminder that as of last June 2020, the Supreme Court has ruled that gender identity and sexual orientation are both protected under the 1964 Civil Rights Act that prohibits workplace discrimination, which means whether or not you are personally comfortable working with queer people, you are legally prohibited from discriminating against them in any way. And speaking more softly, I suppose, to those who want to make their workplaces better for LGBTQ employees and for all of their employees, I would say, and Tim, I'm going to kick it to you to talk more expansively on this. Start by making sure your non-discrimination policies for your workplace are explicitly stated and reinforced, whether it's in workshops and trainings that you do just within your organization. And we've also talked about making sure that you have an employee handbook that explicitly states that no one on your staff will be discriminated against by management, and that discrimination from colleagues will not be tolerated.
Absolutely agreed, 100%. And the other thing I think that's really important from the employer or manager standpoint first is realizing and coming to terms with why it's important. And this speaks to really from a human resources perspective. You know, it has been shown that LGBTQ plus individuals that feel safe to be open and 100% out at work are more productive. The morale in the workplace is better. Those employees are going to stay with you longer. And we've already talked about what positive attributes a member of the queer community may bring to the funeral service profession. So why wouldn't you want to, you know, keep them on your team? And so in ways, again, big and small, you can show that you accept those individuals. If it is going back to learning a little bit about Pride Month and promoting that on your Facebook page, that makes a huge difference and resonates in a major way for those LGBTQ members of your staff. And from the standpoint of, as you said, Rob, even the members of your staff that don't identify as part of the community, how can they help the decision makers? I really just flip the coin, you know, go to them and say, listen, so-and-so on our team, you know that they are part of the LGBTQ community, and we don't do anything to really show that we support he or she or whoever they are. Right. Let's do something more. And I think it's really simple, small things that can go a long way.
A small act, it goes back to what we started with, the small act of kindness.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I guess also just, and maybe this ties into some of the fears, or unpacking some of the fears you were talking about earlier. As silly as this sounds, I think it needs to be repeated to people sometimes, that queer persons are just like straight persons. And, you know, transgender persons are just like cisgender persons. We all, you know, want to do good by our families and want healthy relationships with our partners and want to be professionally successful. And certainly in our professions, we want to give back to the community and to the world. And, you know, if there's lingering doubts that someone coming out on your staff means that, you know, every day is going to be a discussion of sexual behaviors or genitalia, you know, pushing those biases to the side and realizing, you know, we are far more alike than we are different. And the ways that we are different are ways that don't negatively impact the workplace. So I think that's important to just remember as well.
Well, this has been an eye-opener for me, hopefully for our listeners as well. Sara and Tim, you guys have met. You've started doing a few of these talks here and there, but really this looks like it's something that is going to continue. And how can we support you in continuing this? How can we get your information out? Can you share with us your email so people can contact you with questions, or potentially, hey, what would it take to get you to come to our convention? Can you share a contact with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've done so many different kinds of sessions virtually in the last year and a half. I think we're both really ready to be in person for some of these moving forward. So happy to respond to those requests. email is Sara Murphy Deaf Educator. That's SARA MURPHY Deaf Educator @gmail.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Yep, and same for me. I am on LinkedIn. Timothy McLoone, I think is if you look that up, I should come up. And my email address is tpmcloone@gmail.com.
Perfect. Well, we're going to put both of those on this video so people can read them. I want to thank you both for what you're doing. I just in this conversation alone, but in other conversations that I've heard you give, to me, I come away with a new piece of information, something that I've learned from listening to the both of you. And for that, I'm grateful. I'm grateful that you've taught me, and I'm grateful for what you're doing. So I do want to say thank you for doing what you're doing and being bold enough to stand up and say, you know, we're here and we want to share our story. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming on and talking with us.
Oh, thank you for having us, Rob, and for, you know, helping us do this kind of education and getting it out to your membership. This was fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, an honor to be here. And as Sara and I say a lot, it's an honor to be doing this. So if we can reach some people and keep on going, we're going to. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. And when somebody runs for the elevator, hold the door open, because you never know how it's going to change your life.
It's so true. It's so true. If he had let me be crushed by the doors, I wouldn't be able to do all of this great work.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for coming on. Until next time, everybody, we will see you all. Thanks for watching Member Talks by WSFDA. Bye-bye.